Hello and welcome to this special interview here on the sidelines of a regional conference happening here in Dakar, Senegal, discussing African regional integration. And all of this based on the whole question of Pan-Africanism. And what better person to have to discuss this subject than Samia Nkurumah. She is the daughter of the great Pan-Africanist, the first president of Ghana, that country that became independent in 1957. Kwame Nkurumah, or Osagie for Kwame Nkurumah, as he was better known. And we're going to be finding out from her, the daughter, about who this man really was from that perspective. But thank you very much, Madam Samia, for joining us for this interview. This is a very special conversation, I think, for you. Because it's talking about Pan-Africanism, and you are someone who has grown up in a family where Pan-Africanism must have been a byword. What is your reflection on the state of Africa today, particularly from that perspective of what Kwame Nkrumah dreamt of those 60 or so years ago?
Yes, indeed. Thank you for having me and for your interest in this very important topic. Reality of the matter, at least from where I'm standing, is that we are yet to gain our full sovereignty or our full liberation. So we started on that journey by gaining national independence, political independence. And great leaders like our father started laying the foundation for what we call economic emancipation. That is regaining control of our resources and lifting us out of the dependency syndrome. But of course, that project was interrupted with his exit and his not just his, the elimination of people like him, strong nationalists, Pan-Africanists leaders who had the ability, the intellect and the organizational skill to make that a reality. So I see the African Unity Project as a decolonization tool. It's one of the steps we must take to be completely decolonized. This is why conferences like this are very, very important, because they remind us of why we are talking about African unity. And as you said, I cannot run away from what I represent. And I believe our father's thesis on African unity was the most powerful, and we need to revisit it, because he told us we need economic and political unity, that there has to be a common political basis to our unity, because without that, it's going to be a very slow affair, as we've seen. We need to unify our policies for industrial development, economic planning on a continental basis, military and defense strategy, a common one, and of course, common foreign policy and diplomacy. So comprehensive. We can't take unity and isolate the different components. Say we are going to talk about economic unity, but forget common policies, common political basis. It won't work.
Now, thinking about this true emancipation that Kwame Nkrumah talked about, he actually saw the flag independence or political independence as we saw it in 1960s and 1957 for the case of Ghana. What was this thesis that he had about flag independence being just the beginning of a much wider journey of emancipation for Africa?
Yeah, it was a very, very important first step. Gaining independence from the colonial powers. Without it, we couldn't begin to talk about African unity. So we needed to start from there. But as you rightly said, it wasn't an end in itself. It was a means to start restructuring our economies. Because why do we want our independence? Yes, for our dignity, but also to improve the standard of living of our people. Because the old system of colonialism did not work in our favor, was not in our interests. So how do we reach a stage where we are taking charge? And our father famously said on the eve of our independence, we will show the world that the Black man and woman, of course, can manage their own affairs. So we are taking charge. So it was necessary to start with it. But as you also rightly said, it was just the first step. If we become complacent and think, oh, we've arrived, we have our flag, national anthem, then, of course, we would be misleading ourselves, because colonialism didn't leave us. You know, there was still economic domination, marginalization. And that is what African unity, coming together, would address. Because separately, as small individual states with economies that are not viable, that cannot stand up to the big blocs in the world, means if we maintain that division that was imposed on us, small economies unviable economically as states, then we will not be able to gain that economic advancement and prosperity for our people.
How was it growing up as an Nkurumah, and how has that shaped your life?
Oh dear, yeah. I mean, this is a big question, because I'm just humbled, and I feel so privileged to be associated with him in any way. But as I said in the past, for me, Kwame Nkrumah is not my dad only, but he's my leader. He's an African prophet. He came, he saw, and he left us a vision in many of his writings. So I see him as a leader, even more than as a biological father. And I'm just so humbled to be associated with him. And at the same time, it gives me a sense of responsibility that I need to make a small contribution to promoting his legacy. And that's why I'm here.
Now, many people may not have a very good sense of who Kwame Nkrumah was as a person, away from all the public profiles that we have read of, been taught in classes of history. But as someone who grew up in that household, there are specific moments you remember, and one of them that I have heard you talk about a lot was the coup, that 24th of February 1966 it was, when Kwame Nkrumah was deposed from power. You were still just a young girl, but you have spoken before about how much you remember on this day.
Absolutely. And that is the thing with any revolution or great upheaval, however positive it is. Of course, the leaders pay, the main players pay a price, because you have to give it everything. That's what I've seen and learned from our father's experience. That was his life. He gave it everything. So automatically, in a sense, even your family comes second. You see, these are years of sacrifice. Leaders had to sacrifice to bring about liberation. So yes, indeed, it is precisely because of the tribulations and trials and challenges that our family went through that I became very interested in trying to understand what was our father trying to do, you know, to the extent that it consumed his whole life. The day of the coup was one of those, you know, moments of awakening, because we were uprooted from our base, our home, which was Ghana. And at the end of the day, thanks to the intervention of the Egyptians, it was a military coup, of course, led by a clique of officers and police, who incidentally mostly were educated in the UK, Sandhurst College. So that shaped their ideology, which is something important for us to remember. Anyway, so we were living in the presidential residence at the time. Our father was not in Ghana, which was a very good thing. He was ironically on a peace mission to broker a peace between Hanoi and Washington. So we wake up at dawn, the small hours of the morning of the 24th of February 1966, and we wake up at the sound of gunshots, which I later learned was a battle between the Coups soldiers and the presidential guard. And of course, we are small children. We wake up crying, terrified. We rushing to our mother's room. The three of us, we are three from our mother and father, rushed to her room, our mother's room, and then we see her on the phone speaking in Arabic, a language we did not understand then. And apparently she was talking to the Egyptian chargé d'affaires to ask him to send a message to Cairo. She's an Egyptian and she needs to, with her children, leave the country safely. Then she asked us to pray, which we did. And she said, okay, if anything happens to you, if they fire at you, rather, she said her words, I remember them very well. Now, if they fire at you, because we are hearing gunshots, if they fire at you, nothing is going to happen to you. Now we've prayed for God's protection. Nothing will happen to you. Of course, coming from your mother, that means a lot. But she was a typical African woman. Our father would say Africans are spiritual beings, and we are. It is true. Anyway, after that, we were ordered to leave the house with nothing but the clothes on our backs, which we did. We were wrapped up in white blankets and taken into a car, and basically the whole day was spent moving from one place to another. They were not sure what to do with us, but they did not harm us. And we ended up in the police headquarters in Ghana and Accra, where the Egyptians, the diplomats, the chargé d'affaires came to take us to the airport to wait to be transported to Egypt on an empty Egypt flight. We were the only passengers, and it took us safely to Cairo. When we arrived there, in the middle of the night, our father had reached China by then, and he called us to reassure us. And I remember what he told me, because he spoke to each and every one of us. And when it was my turn, he said, Yaba, which is my Ghanaian name, he said, Yaba, I don't want you to be afraid. Be strong. Be strong. And I thought he was referring to my incessant crying the whole of that day. I was so terrified. I was literally crying the whole day. I only stopped when we got into the plane.
Baby.
Yes, and I felt something terrible is happening. They are going to separate us. So many things were going in my head, and the guns and the soldiers. It was just a terrifying experience. So I thought someone had told him. I was crying the whole day. But on reflection and with the passage of time, I think he was saying, don't be afraid of telling our story, and don't be afraid of promoting the legacy, and carry on and don't give up.
It's interesting that you would have gone to Egypt. Obviously, your mother was from Egypt. That was part of this. But there was also this stronger bond between your father and Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, a fellow Pan-Africanist, a fellow freedom fighter. Tell us a little bit about the Egypt experience and all these connections that made it possible for you to find secure refuge in Egypt.
There was a shared vision, actually, between Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, the leader at the time, and Kwame Nkrumah, our father. And in fact, that alliance, that strong understanding between them, both anti-imperialist, anti-colonial leaders, that actually made the marriage possible between our mother and father in the first place, because Gamal Abdel Nasser had to intervene to reassure the family, who was thinking, well, you are taking this young woman what is Ghana? Who are these people? What is their culture? What do they eat? So Gamal Abdel Nasser's intervention was crucial for the family to agree. Now, it was a political marriage, of course, because it was arranged. Our father conceived of it and said, yeah, he wants to marry an Egyptian. And I can't help feeling, I mean, we all came to that conclusion that part of this, the idea of this particular union was to bring North Africa closer to the rest of the continent. And as he famously said, the Great Sahara Desert must not divide us, but rather unite us. And it did, in fact, over the years, because you see, when Ghana got independence in 1957, Africa south of the Sahara was not independent. I mean, with the exception, of course, of Liberia. Ethiopia, too, was never colonized. But basically, very few countries. It's North Africa, countries like Egypt, Morocco, Algeria. In fact, we helped Algeria, and Algeria in turn, just like Egypt and other North African countries, helped many liberation movements in every way, logistics, training camps, just like Ghana. So just as Ghana's independence started real cooperation we had a Bureau of African Affairs. We were giving passports to Southern African activists who couldn't leave their countries. I mean, there and then, the few independent countries, including North Africa, with this rapprochement, this new closeness, they decided all independent countries are going to help other countries who are struggling for independence. And that accounts to a large extent for the success of the decolonization, at least as far as gaining political independence in the 60s. One country after the other started gaining independence. So that closeness, that bringing those independent African states closer, North African states, closer to Black Africa, helped in two things: with the decolonization process, and number two, with African unity. Because when we first started talking about African unity in Ghana, when Ghana invited in 1958, a year after our independent African states, and then the same year, we held the All African People's Conference. Leaders of all independent movements came to Ghana, you see? So we set the tone for this collaboration. And sometimes I wonder, if we did not unite to defeat colonialism, what would have happened? What would have happened? And that's a lesson we need to take today. Today, the fight is for economic emancipation. So if we don't unite, we are not going to achieve it. It will be very difficult. Unity is essential for us Africans to reach our true goal of independence, and that is to attain economic advancement.
I suppose that growing up in a family like that would have exposed you to many other Pan-Africanists, whether they were on the continent or they were in diaspora. Maybe you could let us in on some of the names, some of the conversations that you had in the Nkurumah household as you grew up.
We were exposed at an early age, of course, and we saw some of these leaders. We even saw Sheikh Anyas, Ibrahim Anyas, who was close to our father. I mean, I remember we used to be terrified of him, just his image with his dress, his his attire, very impressive attire. But later I learned and read about his closeness to Kwame Nkrumah. So we were exposed to many things. We had the picture of Che Guevara, who incidentally was in Ghana in 64, passing on his way, from the Congo. Our father met him. So yes, you can't have a father like Kwame Nkrumah doing this, all important Pan-African work without being exposed to so many leaders and so many stories.
Now, another thing that I think one reflects on 60 years or so after Nkurumah is the fact that he was deposed through a military coup that was in very controversial circumstances at the time. Fingers were pointed at the West. We had seen that happen, for example, with Patrice Lumumba. He was actually killed. 60 years later, we still see coups in Africa. One, of course, has to admit that the circumstances tend to be different from case to case. But isn't it something to talk about that this many years later, circumstances still present themselves in countries that either make it necessary for coups to take place or in some way leads to this overthrow of government that we have seen in some countries, even more recently here in West Africa?
Absolutely. And you see, something has to be said here in that not all coups are the same. For example, the coup that toppled our father was now by universal acknowledgement, CIA backed and funded. Yeah. So that is clear. But it happens that some coups are actually progressive. Of course, there's always a hope that eventually the voice of the people would be, would be heard and things would return to some kind of stability and democracy, even though the way we practice democracy is problematic. But that's maybe a different topic. But suffice it to say on that topic that we are practicing democracy in a way that is too partisan, too divisive in many of our countries, and too monetized. So there is something wrong with it. So sometimes democracy doesn't produce the best leaders, but it produces, leaders who can spend a lot during elections. And sometimes you wish that money that goes in electioneering could be spent on building industries, which we badly need to wean us of dependency from the north of the world. But back to your point, yes, these coups are a symptom of people not being happy with the situation. It's symbol of economic underdevelopment and dissatisfaction with the system that's not delivering to African citizens, you see. So they give us a lot of food for thought, of course. It means things are not right with us. But we know that. Everybody knows that. In our countries, we know we are importing too much and we are not productive enough. But that's partly because we are fragmented. We have to do something about our socioeconomic conditions, you see? Because as long as most people are in distress, most people are struggling, there will always be instability, So I think we need to focus on socioeconomic development. And one thing that will help us greatly, and I keep on returning to it, is if we integrate our economies. But to do that, we need to integrate our policies and have a common political basis, as our father advised us.
Now, if Africa had followed what Kwame Nkrumah dreamt of, if Africa had lived up to that dream that he had, what do you think would be the state of Africa today?
We would be an African nation, 1.34 billion plus the diaspora, because he never left the global African family. Many were even in Ghana. George Padmore, the Trinidadian lawyer, was his advisor on African affairs. You can see he dedicated Africa Must Unite to George Padmore, my advisor on African affairs. So the diaspora has to come in. So you're talking about over 1.5 million Africans, an African nation that could very well have become, or on the way to becoming, a superpower. This is how our father saw us. An economic power, a superpower, not to exploit or colonize others, but to become a great force for peace and security in the world. I have no doubt that had we progressed in unity, we would have delivered to our people, definitely, built our infrastructure, our industries, and that must be the mission of this generation. This is why some of us are urging us to revisit the ideas and the thoughts and the writings and the speeches and the policies of people like Kwame Nkrumah, because that is where our salvation today lies. Young people must be reintroduced and absorb these ideas. You don't have to agree with everything. And of course, we are in a different era. Like you point, 6 years have passed, so you can adapt certain things to today's circumstances. But the core of the message, the political and economic unity of Africa, I think must remain a goal and a mission for this generation to accomplish.
You talked about something related to this whole multi-party politics and what you call overly partisan politics. And I'm curious to hear about that, because some people see that as a mark of democracy.
Yes, so I believe we need to tap into our indigenous knowledge systems in everything we do in our societies, in politics, the way we practice it, do away with the winner takes all, build consensus. In our medicine, that we need to go back to, in addition to conventional medicine, but we need to improve our research in our herbal traditional medicine, because I believe there's a lot of wisdom there. In our education, in everything we do, basically, and in politics, as we said earlier.
Now, thinking about that legacy, and when we think about Kwame Nkrumah, what do you think would be a befitting legacy to give him as Africans? And what does that look like in reality, thinking about what is happening on the continent today?
We have this saying in Ghana that you have to know where you came from to know where you are going. So, we have this Akan symbol called Sankofa, going back to pick it up. So to be able to move forward, you need to look back. So we need to revisit Kwame Nkrumah and other, of course, philosophers, Sheikh Anta Diop, Theo Bing, there are many, but Kwame Nkrumah's thesis on African unity needs to be in schools, needs to enter the mainstream, schools, universities, courses. Agree or disagree with him, as I said, become acquainted with what he said, because I think that holds the key to Africa's success.
How would you like Africa to remember your father, the great Pan-Africanist whose legacy continues to reverberate not just across the African continent and global Africa, the African diaspora, but across the entire world? How would you want us to remember Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah?
Great Pan-Africanists and activists, an organizer par excellence, and just someone we need to study. We need to study Nkrumah.
Thank you so much.